Poppy Playtime Chapter 4 gave us some huge lore implications for the story, but one of the biggest developments this chapter was the relationship between Poppy and the prototype, Experiment 1006. Now, while we once again only got a small snippet of the overall picture, I do think the end of Chapter 4 has some pretty strong hints for exactly why the prototype wants to keep Poppy locked in her case, and it all kind of makes sense now. So right at the end of Chapter 4, just before the big reveal that Huggy is back, we get our first conversation between the prototype and Poppy. Well, technically not the first one. We learn that Ollie was the prototype all along. Who could have ever foreseen this twist? But the prototype says several things to Poppy that stood out to me. First, he tells Poppy to end this charade, to come home. Keep a pin in that one. But he also tells her that he has something special in mind for her, and at this one, she will never want to leave. Now, this really does imply that the prototype wants Poppy back in her case. In fact, it now seems like the reason there were warnings written on Poppy's door was because somebody was afraid of what the prototype would do if we freed Poppy, more so than being afraid of Poppy herself. But why? Why would the prototype want to keep Poppy trapped in her case, something she's clearly terrified of? Especially since we know the prototype does seem to show kindness towards the other experiments. Well, I think Chapter 4 gave us all the clues we need to figure this one out. We learnt this chapter that the toys are slowly turning rabid. This now perfectly explains why some of the toys are friendly and can talk, and others act more like mindless zombies. Now, we don't know exactly why the toys are turning rabid, but to me it seems like it's psychological. This chapter gave us evidence that the toys over time become what they are. This makes sense. The longer you spend in a toy body, the more likely you are to start to believe that you really are a toy. But Dowie the Doman also gave us a huge clue to this as well. Now, we learnt in Chapter 4 that Dowie was 3 children put into one experiment: Jack, Kevin, and Matthew. Now, if that wasn't creepy enough, each one of these human consciousnesses had to share the body, but one of these personalities was deeply troubled. Throughout most of the game, we see Dowie switch between 2 of the personalities. Matthew is the main personality. He's the older of the 3 children and a natural leader. That's why Dowie decided not to leave the factory and to come back to protect the toys in the prison. But throughout the game, you can see that Dowie sometimes turns to a more playful and more mischievous side.
Hiya there, pal. Don't worry, I won't eat you. I'm Dowie. I was told to expect you. This way, follow me.
This is when the personality of Jack is showing through, the young boy who fell into the vat of dough in the Dowie VHS at the start of the game. But every now and then, very occasionally, you can hear the third personality slip through. Notice when Dowie gets angry, usually when mentioning the staff, you can hear that monster voice come through just a little.
They'd watch from up there. It was usually over within minutes. And the guards, they'd be hysterical. Nobody died. No, because then people would know. But the next day and every day after, they would work. Oh yeah, hard as they could. And they'd never cause trouble again.
That monster voice is Kevin, the problem child of the 3 and the one that the other 2 children seem to try and keep contained. The scientist in Chapter 4 explained that one crack, one emotional break was all it took for this experiment to unravel. This is exactly what we see towards the end of the game as Dowie turns into his monster form. The emotional impact of not being able to save the toys broke Matthew's spirit, allowing Kevin to break free, so to speak. But this isn't the first time we've seen a toy break in this way. All the way back in Chapter 2, I said it seemed strange that Mommy Longlegs had such a drastic change in personality. At first, she's creepy, sure, but Mommy is mostly friendly. She plays with us, yes, hoping that we would fail on the tests and be eaten, but not actively harming us. But by the end of the game, Mommy had completely changed. She turned aggressive, more mindless and monstrous. Mommy turned rabid. Aside from the obvious differences, there was a subtle clue that accompanied this change. Once rabid, Mommy's eyes had changed. This is something we saw with Dowie too. His eyes had been just empty sockets up until this point, but once he turned rabid, his eyes went red. So this is pretty great evidence that the toys turn rabid once their mind eventually breaks. Between being starved, the red smoke, trauma from being experimented on, and the daily horrors of the factory both before and after the Hour of Joy, these toys are slowly going insane. All of them are just one emotional breakdown away from turning rabid. Now it seems like Stella Graber had even figured this out. We learn in Kissy's note in chapter 4 that Stella had figured out what Kissy really needed more than anything was normality. These orphans were being kept in cells after being transformed into toys, and Kissy wanted nothing more than to return to her old room. Stella talks about great improvements to her nerves when allowed to socialize, and recommends that she be slowly allowed more freedom around the factory. But this is where things get really interesting. If all these experiments are slowly turning rabid, then why hasn't Poppy, strongly suggested to be the oldest living experiment, turned rabid yet? Well, it turns out that she is. Many people have noticed that in chapter 4, Poppy's eyes have turned bloodshot. This was actually present at the end of chapter 3. You can see these bloodshot eyes while she's on the elevator. But this ties into one of my oldest theories about Poppy. You can see in chapter 2, when we rescue Poppy from Mommy, that her pupils are enlarged and Poppy seems to be slightly out of it. This progression from chapter 1 and the start of 2 to now seems like this fits exactly with that same pattern of the other toys going rabid. Why is it only happening to Poppy now? Because she's been kept locked asleep in her case, a crude form of stasis. But we can even see that Poppy has shown several times that she's displaying those same emotional outbursts as the other toys. We saw it in the CG5 music video that was set during the Hour of Joy, and we see it now again at the end of chapter 4. I think this ties into exactly the reason why the prototype is acting the way that he is. If you got the secret VHS tape in Harley Sawyer's office, you learn that the prototype is working towards some big breakthrough. Even after all these years, he's still experimenting. This is the reason why he kept Harley Sawyer alive, so that they could try and tackle a problem that they both couldn't solve even when the factory was fully operational. Now I have several guesses as to what this breakthrough could be. It could be the reversal of the scientific process. It could be the transfer of consciousness between experiments to humans. It could even be bringing people back from the dead. Or, alternatively, it could be a way to stop the toys turning rabid. But whatever it is, I think the prototype's intentions have now been made perfectly clear. For all his faults, he really does care about Poppy. Remember, we've seen a bunch of evidence that the prototype does care for the orphans and the experiments that they became. We learned that the prototype was about to escape the factory when he sacrificed his own freedom to bring Theo back to the staff after he suffered an electric shock. We further see the prototype act warmly to Catnap in the music video. Then there is the fact that he allowed several of the toys to live freely in the factory for over 10 years until we arrived, even feeding them. Now yes, it's a bit creepy that he's feeding them corpses, but what else is he going to do? Can't exactly pop to his local shop now, can he? So why do we see this aggressive side of the prototype, and why does he seem so mean to Poppy? Well, here is where we board the train to Theory Town, because I think I have an explanation for that one as well. Now there are two different avenues that we could go down for this one. One, the prototype is, as we have suspected all along, Elliot Ludwig. The other is that the prototype views himself and Poppy as special, since they were the first experiments to come to life, so to speak. Now if the latter is true, we could be getting into a whole Alpha and Omega symbolism. Poppy is the first experiment and 1006 as the last, the greatest. Perhaps the prototype sees Poppy as part of his new race with him as the god, essentially seeing Poppy's escape as a betrayal. But if the prototype is indeed what remains of Elliot, I think all of these puzzle pieces could fit together perfectly. Elliot was described as a family man. One of the oldest theories was that Elliot's obsession with the company, with science, was his desperate attempt to revive his lost child. Now chapter 4 lends even more evidence to this case. We learn from the red tape that Poppy is indeed most likely the child of Elliot. She talks about missing her dad and that the company was better when he ran the place. Well, if the prototype is Elliot, then that would make perfect sense as to why he has spent the last 10 years trying to work on this breakthrough. He wants to save Poppy. We have long theorized now that the Hour of Joy was 1006's last chance, his last attempt to stop the experiments happening to children within the factory, something that Sawyer really ramped up during his time with the company. But since that day, the prototype has kept every experiment locked away inside the factory. Now the thing is, Poppy agreed with him. Of course, these experiments can't leave. They wouldn't exactly be able to go out and live normal lives. They would likely be arrested, dissected, or even worse. So in these last 10 years, the prototype has been trying to keep everything under control while he continued to work on his research. His research to save Poppy. He knew it was only a matter of time before Poppy turned rabid, her mind broken and lost forever. So, just like the remaining orphans, he put Poppy inside her case, filled it with catnap's gas, and kept her asleep. This is why he ordered Huggy to stop us. This is why he ordered Mommy to take Poppy and give us the train code so that we could leave. And this is why he had Catnap crash the train and give us our final warning to leave. All this time, the prototype was trying to get Poppy back into her case, back into stasis. He just didn't expect us to be so persevering. This is why the prototype attacked Kissy at the end of chapter 3. Notice how Kissy shakes when hearing his voice. She's scared of him because he was the one who did this to her. He was getting desperate by this point. He doesn't want Poppy going down to the prison because he knew exactly how dangerous it was. And since Poppy is his daughter, he would do anything to protect her. Now consider everything he has done to keep her alive all this time. He sacrificed his marriage to do it, sacrificed his own good name to do it, and now it seems like he has sacrificed the lives of others to keep hers intact. The way Poppy talks about the prototype to me sounds like a child rebelling against their parent, and the reason why the prototype is being so stern with Poppy is because he tried the nice way and she didn't listen. He's literally trying to save her life, and she is risking everything by being out of her case before he makes his breakthrough. Come on, tell me that the prototype doesn't have that disappointed dad tone.
Stop that.
You don't need to pretend anymore.
Poppy. You don't need to play at being stronger than you are.
You can
Come home.
But this would also make perfect sense as to why Ollie seems so keen on being a friend to Poppy. We know that Ollie was real once. Ollie seemed like it might have been the nickname of Elliot. But we hear in one tape that Ollie really is trying to connect with her. He listens to her talk about the horrific things that they did to her. Poppy describes how the bad men took parts out of her and put them back in, over and over again. Something that we saw in one of the very first trailers for Poppy Playtime. Now, of course, this might have been Playtime Co. trying to perfect their experiment, but it just might have been Elliot's attempt to fix her. But we now know that all this time, Ollie was the prototype. So why was the prototype pretending to be Ollie, and why was he trying to be there for Poppy? Well, if the prototype is Elliot, then this could have been his way of still being there for her, being a friend to her, because he knew that he could no longer be there for her as her father. Just like Darth Vader, he is her father.
He's more machine now than man.
Seeing what her father had become might have been enough to tip Poppy over the edge. So he created Ollie as a way to still look after her the best that he could. Perhaps this is why the prototype uses a jumble of voices. He's masking his own voice to keep that terrible truth away from his precious daughter. In fact, I think Poppy learning this truth is exactly what's going to tip her over the edge. I've been theorizing since day one that Poppy is going to be the big villain of the series, and now we have exactly the explanation for that to happen. Poppy has had more trauma than any of these toys. She's been alive for longer than any of them. She feels personal guilt for a lot of what Playtime Co. did, and now she feels guilt for her role in the Hour of Joy. Every single moment she spends out of her case, reliving that trauma, is one step closer to Poppy turning rabid. A fact that the prototype knows, and something he's willing to do whatever it takes to stop. In fact, this could even set up our final showdown with the prototype. Remember, he too is an experiment, meaning there is a chance that he too could turn rabid. Maybe over time this is why he's turning more aggressive. Seeing his daughter finally turn, seeing his worst nightmare finally come true, might just be enough to tip the prototype over the edge. And then, oh then, we really will be in trouble. I think this theme of family fits in perfectly. The prototype was trying to create a utopia for his daughter, just like Elliot was. She was his world, and he was trying to give her the best life possible, just like he did for all those orphans over the years. He created a home for her, made friends for her, and ultimately killed for her. This would also mirror how many people saw Elliot. Many people looked up to Elliot as this great and wonderful man, and now many of these toy experiments look up to the prototype as a form of God. Kind of a parallel there. I think that's why even after everything that Poppy has done, the prototype just wants her to come home. but I also think that all of these choices the prototype is making is what eventually is going to cause both of their downfalls. It would be a huge twist of irony if every single horror this factory ever produced was in some way tied to Elliot's attempt to play God and save his dying daughter. By trying to make the world a better place, by trying to stop children from dying, Elliot actually caused more pain and suffering than ever before. You know what they say, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Just like that golden path that Harley Sawyer talks about. While none of this is her fault, all this horror is a result of Poppy's existence, and that guilt, Elliot's selfish choice, is exactly what's going to cause everything to unravel. But there is one final possibility that I want to discuss. The possibility that the prototype isn't Elliot, it's just his final creation. Knowing that he was going to die and knowing that his daughter was going to be left all alone, Elliot poured all of his genius, all of his intellect into one final invention. His final prototype. This is tied into what we hear about Elliot's machines. We know that Elliot created the Make-A-Friend machine and that seems to be on some level alive. Harley Sawyer even talks in chapter 4 about Elliot's machines. There is the chance that the prototype is Elliot's final machine, and this was one that he created with one sole purpose: to keep innovating. This would be a way for him to continue his work after his death. Perhaps he programmed 1006 with multiple directives in mind. 1. Keep innovating, and 2. Keep Poppy safe. I personally like the idea that the prototype is Elliot more, but I could also see Mob going down this route too. As the final creation of Elliot Ludwig, it would make sense as to why the rest of the company wanted to try and reverse engineer what he created. This would explain why Harley Sawyer was trying to find a secret from him. And this would also explain why in these last 10 years, the prototype has continued on that research. Perhaps his final directive, and the reason why he's friendly to some toys, was to create a utopia for Poppy and the other experiments. The prototype's final directive was to bring them joy. But hey, that's just an idea. Tericho at it. Nah, I'm only joking. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I will see you next time.